Here.
Councilor McLaughlin. With 9 councilors present and 2 absent, we have a quorum.
Excellent. So, colleagues, we are here tonight with one item on the agenda. Madam Clerk, would you please read our agenda?
Item number 2 is the communication of the mayor conveying the city's key fiscal trends in relation to the development of the fiscal year 2023 budget.
Thank you very much. So, colleagues, we are honored to be joined by Mayor Ballantyne this evening. In just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to her for a brief introduction, and then we'll hear from a number of staff members. It is my intention that if there are questions that come up during the presentation, just like a regular council meeting, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on folks. If people want to hold questions till the end, we'll do that as well, but people should feel comfortable as long as the conversation doesn't completely derail the presentation. I think it'd be good to go in order as questions come up. And with that, I will turn over the floor to you, Mayor Ballantyne.
Thank you. Thank you to the council and the public for attending and tuning in this evening. And, for those of you who have not been in the space, welcome to our new high school. As the council knows, for the first time, I introduced additional options for the council to participate in proposals for the budget, well in advance of the budget development and hearings. We received your thoughtful and valuable proposals earlier this year. Review is ongoing. We will address them through the budget hearings as planned. So again, thank you for your proposals in support of our community. Tonight, as part of an effort to build greater transparency and inclusion into the budget process for the council, we have 2 presentations to offer general and local context. They should be informative for the public as well. We're excited to have Evan Horowitz, the Executive Director of the Center of State Policy Analysis at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University here. He will provide the big picture on how municipal budgets work and come together. We're also fortunate to have City Auditor and Finance Director Ed Bean here this evening. He will share specific context for this year's budget, including new revenues, the impacts of broader economic factors, including inflation, and a look at forecasting. In short, our usual budget process will address the specifics of the proposed fiscal year 2023 budget. But tonight, we'll be taking a look at all the levers involved in creating the budget. My hope is that this will provide additional context and a foundation for you as you take on a solemn duty of reviewing the city's budget for the coming fiscal year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Ballantyne. And who are we turning it over to now? So we're excited to have Evan Horowitz here. Mr. Horowitz, welcome. If you would please just introduce yourself for the record.
Do you have a microphone I can walk around?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, that's bright. You can't see it. There's a bright light right in your eyes. All right, I'll do my best not to squint. I'm Evan Horowitz, the Executive Director for the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tisch College. I want to say first a thank you to the mayor and her team for inviting me to participate, and to the City Council for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about city budgets and how they work and what it means for the city of Somerville. I should say a little bit about how I approach slides. There's not going to be anything on the slide that I'm not going to talk about. This is not like a situation where a slide comes up and you have to read it quickly, because I expect you to intuit everything that's there and then I'll talk about some other thing. It's not like that. If there are words on the slide, I'm going to talk through them, and then we're going to think about them together, and then we're going to ask questions about them. And anytime you have a question about a slide or a topic on a slide, just stop me. I'm not a robot, and I'm capable of pausing and then picking up the routine thereafter. Can you go to the next? Perfect. So there are 4 big topics that I'm going to be covering here. 1, the big picture, how to think about budgets, what budgets mean. 2, city and town budgets in Massachusetts, Somerville as it compares to other towns throughout the Commonwealth. 3, your city's budget. And 4, looking ahead to 2023. And we'll take some time, as I say. The idea here is to sit with the slides when they're complicated, talk through them, and just get a better understanding of all the pieces and how they fit together. Because I know for some people, well, for some people this is, you know, your umpteenth budget. For others, it's a first or a second time through.
One moment, I have a question. So I think this is for the clerk. If there are questions from the council, do they need their own microphones? So, okay, Rose has the microphone. Great, thank you.
All right, so part one, act one, how to think about budgets. Okay, so budgets are really powerful, right? It's generally the most important, most impactful thing we do every year. It's where the rubber meets the road for political commitments, because it's how you decide how to spend the money that you're asking residents to contribute to the greater good. So you have this opportunity to look across the entirety of local government activity, everything that the city is doing, to assess the value of and importance of different programs. Are we spending the right amount on this relative to this other thing? Are we forgetting some group, some initiative, some issue? And then to allocate money to make things better. It's not just, are we doing this, but how could we be doing this better in tangible dollar terms? Should we be spending additional dollars here or there or this other place? What would it mean for people's lives? Next slide. But you don't get to start from scratch, right? Budgets come with real constraints. We're bound by decisions that have been made in the past. That includes sort of negotiated contracts, debts, obligations. And that's the reason that you don't start from scratch. I mean, there is a process, you know, called zero-based budgeting. There's a thing out there where you say every year, let's just pretend we've never had a budget before. I won't tell the story. I have a story about Nathan Lane. You can ask me about it later and how he stopped a Broadway show when people came in. It was the funniest thing I've ever experienced. Anyway, zero-based budgeting. So there is this approach where you start every year saying, pretend we've never had a budget before. We're starting from scratch. Where we put our money? The problem with this is you don't have that much flexibility because of these prior commitments and constraints. So the standard is to build off the decisions of recent years. Look at what you spent last year, look at what you spent the year before, think about what adjustments need to be made, but not, hey, let's pretend we've never done this before. So putting it together, you get kind of budgets equals goals plus constraints. So you think about politics, which all of you are much more expert at than I am. But that's often about goals and values, the things you believe in, the things you want to fight for. And budgets are something else, right? They're not about values and principles. They're about trade-offs and choices and constraints. You're going to spend here and not there. You believe in two things, but you only have enough money to do one of those things, or one and a half of those things, or both of them, but not well. And you have to make those choices. So with a limited amount of money and a host of pre-existing obligations, you need to choose priorities and spot opportunities. I'll pause here because this is the end of this kind of first bit about like the power of budgets just as a framing, in case people want to talk about this or have questions.
Would you say this is the only way to think about a budget? Because I've heard different ways to think about it. I'm sure you've heard the term. Budgets are moral documents that are much more values focused than this framing seems to be.
No, but I think they are moral. I'm glad you asked this. This is totally right. They are moral documents in the sense that you are making decisions about the value of your activities and what they mean for people's lives. This is a deep, there's a deep moral commitment here. It just doesn't change the fact that you can't morally commit to everything. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of tragedy. There's like a tragedy of constraints. Like, it would be better if we didn't have them, and because the number of things people believe in is just much greater than the resources we have to act on them in any given year. So there's like a failure of this moral frame, but I think it's totally the right way to think about it. Like, these things really matter. All right, so city and town budgets in Massachusetts. So this is where we'll talk a little bit about kind of the general structure of city and town budgets, how they're made up, what makes them similar, what the limitations are. Okay, so all around the Commonwealth, city and town budgets, they tend to look pretty similar. The reason they look pretty similar is because they're subject to the same rules, they rely on the same kinds of state support, and they have a similar mix of revenues and responsibilities. So if you go into this process with the kinds of constraints that you have in terms of what money you can raise and what the state is already doing, then you end up with a kind of similar mix of activities. We'll start with the revenue side. So most of the revenue, about 2/3 of the revenue for cities and towns in Massachusetts comes from property taxes. This is by far the biggest source. Sorry. Okay. This is by far the biggest source of revenue across the state. The next biggest source is local aid. This is money that the state says, yeah, we raised it through other taxes, but we're going to give it directly to cities and towns. And they give it out according to a formula that's been in place for decades. But they have some discretion in the amounts, and that's the second biggest one. And then local municipalities do have some control over motor vehicle excise taxes, small levies on hotels, meals, marijuana, fees and fines like parking. Those tend to make up a pretty small portion of any given budget because the towns don't have a lot of taxing authority there. And then there are other unique elements like special revenues, grants. Say if you're in a bad year, you might have to draw on your savings account, which is the stabilization fund, or ARPA in an unusual year like now. But no municipalities in Massachusetts levy sales or income taxes, so those are controlled by the state. And that's kind of the trade-off with local aid. The state says, look, there are things you can't tax. We handle those taxes, but we will pass some of this along to actually, originally was connected to lottery stuff, but it's not anymore. So there's a limit to what you can do, and that's why the property tax has become so important, is the driving force for Somerville and for cities and towns across the state. Actually, I should probably stop here. Questions about the general revenue structure? All right. So, and then, even with the property tax, there's a big constraint, which is Proposition 2.5. So in the early 80s, there was a ballot initiative. People complain about ballot initiatives these days, so much policy gets done on the ballot, but that's been happening for a long time. And 40 years ago, it was happening. And Massachusetts voters enacted this policy, which does two main things. One, it limits property taxes in any town to 2.5% of the total value of all property. So there's a cap based on the value of all your property. And two, it limits the growth of property tax revenue to 2.5% per year. So whatever you were collecting last year, you can only collect 2.5% more than that, with the exception of new growth. That's basically new construction. So new businesses, new housing, that gets added in and can be a really important source of revenue for cities and towns. And I should say, you could imagine a world in which you had these limits, but nobody was close to them, so they didn't really bite, and it was okay. But actually, they do. There are a few towns that have excess capacity, meaning they don't levy a property tax up to the maximum amount, but most do, about half do. Right, so it's very rare to have a large gap here. This is a real constraint. Questions on Prop 2.5? Right, next. Okay, another important thing to think about in revenue is the role of business and commercial activity. This is a big distinction between cities and towns across the Commonwealth because it makes a big difference to the amount of revenue that they can raise and how they can use this revenue. So businesses are often a net positive for municipal budgets because they pay property taxes but generally require less in terms of services. As businesses don't have kids that go to school is the big part of it. So having a lot of commercial activity does provide this additional source of revenue. And if you have substantial commercial activity, you can place a higher property tax rate on the businesses than you do on other residents. So you can kind of shift the responsibility for property tax payments to businesses. And the other sort of big thing about commercial activity is the Proposition 2.5 limit. When you have business expansion, that counts as new growth, and it allows you to generate new revenue or additional revenue, which can go into the city budget. So it can be really a powerful kind of boost for needed revenue. Yeah.
When you say businesses are net positive, you're talking strictly municipal services, so water, sewer,
Road repair.
road repair, so are you, I'm gonna ask you a trick question. Are you accounting for, trailer trucks, a business that requires it, and where's the road more? A business that has more people driving in and causing more damage to the road, not contributing to public transportation, is that included in that?
So I think that's the reason that I had often a net positive. There are exceptions.
Okay.
There are businesses that are set up in such a way that they create unique demands on a city or town that can be detrimental and exceed their tax
What I'm
distribution.
trying to say is this is a very simple way of not looking like at a larger,
No, I don't think that. So I think that the data suggests that commercial activity on net, like overall,
yeah.
is beneficial to governments when you know,
I'm not
full
saying
accounting.
it's not, but I'm like, I'm trying to.
But yeah, it's simplified in the sense that, yeah, individual business by individual business, you'd have to do a much different kind of accounting, right? There are definitely cases where businesses do this, but if you didn't know anything about a business versus didn't know anything about someone moving into town, the business is much more likely to be fiscally net positive for the city than the individual is. And that's good because you want the business to subsidize the individual, yeah. No, I'm just, no, it's a great question. I mean, you're totally right.
Impacts that are not typically quantifiable.
And I think that, so it's funny, the one you mentioned that I had in my head was, that is more quantifiable, like what's happening to the roads. I think the non-quantifiable ones would be like, I can't think of a good example, but like some business that would deter people from wanting to be in town, some business that was so noxious to the community, like that would be harder to quantify. So, and on the spending side, so we're talking about the revenue side. On the spending side, there are also some significant constraints on municipal spending decisions. So existing contracts with unions set the wages, benefits, and rules for many municipal workers. That happens outside the scope of the budget. Right? You don't get to set salaries in the scope of the budget. Debts have to be paid according to existing terms. Right? You step into this having made debt commitments as a city that have to be fulfilled. And these predetermined costs require a large percentage of available revenue, leaving less room for discretionary decision making. This is an important point. We'll come back to this for Somerville in particular. But it is the case that a big part of the budget is kind of spoken for in this way. Salaries are established, healthcare is established, pension obligations have been in place for decades. Debts have to be repaid on a schedule that's been agreed to. So you enter a budget with all of these constraints kind of in place, and you just have to work with them. Does that make sense? Questions on that? All right, so just kind of takeaways from this bit about cities and towns. A couple of things to think about when approaching this question or developing a municipal budget. How much revenue can we expect? What kind of revenue are we going to get this year? That includes thinking about the Proposition 2.5 caps, and also new growth, things like that. Additional like marijuana, that's new revenue. Like there was no marijuana revenue 5 years ago. There is now. Makes a big difference. How much will go to fixed and required costs? How much of it is already spoken for? How much new growth already said? And do we have a healthy or appropriate amount of business activity? Right? This is as you say, this is both a fiscal question and also a broader community question. What is the kind of healthy or appropriate amount of business activity? All right. Anything people want to talk about before we go to just specifics of Somerville's budget? Stories about the anti-tax days of Prop 2.5? Okay. So I wanted to put up a comparison chart, I want to sit with this for a second, of a couple of cities and towns and some key measures of what their budgets look like. So just to sort of walk through it, you see it's Somerville, Medford, Brookline, and Arlington. Total revenue, that's all the revenue. This is for fiscal year 22, so the fiscal year that is ending in a couple of months. Total revenue for these towns. The percent of that revenue that is from property taxes, you can see in these cases it's all sort of 2/3 or above. Well, not quite in the Medford case. New growth, so how much new growth revenue was there in these towns in fiscal 22? Excess capacity. This is what I said, like how close are you to the Proposition 2.5 caps? Are they really binding? I'll skip to bond rating and come back to pensions. The bond ratings, probably look like gobbledygook. This is, the bond ratings are set by, big national agencies that kind of determine how much interest you're gonna have to pay back when you borrow money. And, the better your rating, the lower the interest rates. These are the best rates from the two, AAAs and AAAs. Somerville is one notch down in both, but still very, very strong bond ratings. You can see Medford is, I want to say this one is S&P, and this is the Moody's rating. The Moody's rating is a couple of notches down. So that makes a big difference when you think about the debt service. And the pensions, so the funded ratio is sort of kind of a measure of how healthy your city or town pension fund is. Because all the time, you are investing, setting aside money that's being invested to pay for pension obligations, future pension obligations, because you've made promises to city workers. Promises have been made to city workers, those promises have to be paid, and you want to wait until the day that they're due because you won't have enough money to do it. So cities have obligated to set aside money. And this is a measure of how much is being set aside relative to future obligations. So just looking across, you can see that a couple of things, at least to me, I'm interested in what stands out to you. The thing that stands out to me is the new growth revenue in Somerville, which suggests, what the city's done to open itself to new development, and has given additional cushion to revenue. Because remember, this doesn't count in Prop 2.5, right? This gives you opportunity to raise more revenue and get around the cap. Yeah.
Just curious how the choice was made to
I'm just curious how the choice was made to include Medford, Brookline, Arlington versus like Everett, Cambridge, and Malden.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you asked. I tried about 15 different towns. So part of it is we were looking at kind of towns that are comparable, but you're naming other towns that are comparable. Cambridge has a very unique budget setup, so that one gets thrown out straight away. They just organize their budget differently than just about every city or town. Did you say Malden? Yeah. So Malden I tried, and their budget presentation from FY22 was missing key information that I needed for the comparison, but it is a worthwhile comparison. So part of that was just like, hey, can I get the new growth revenue from Malden? No, I can't, so I'm not including it. But it's not to say it's not a useful comparison. It would have been. What do you think would be different if it were there? Like, what do you suspect would be different? Or you're just generally interested?
A lot less new growth and probably a smaller budget overall.
I think the Malden, as I saw it, I think the Malden budget was like 150 million, somewhere in that range, so it is smaller. I couldn't get a new growth number, which is why I didn't include it. Yeah.
Thank you. Off the top of your head, do you remember what, say, Everett's new growth was?
So I didn't look at Everett. I will say I didn't look at Everett.
It turned off again. For my question. Okay. Are there other cities and towns with new growth similar to Somerville's that you've seen before?
So, yes. Boston, for instance, generates a lot of revenue from new growth. But it's those kinds of places where you see some kind of commercial development. It would be Cambridge, it would be Boston. It doesn't come up in the other comparators. So I don't have good, but I looked at Waltham and Watertown. They don't approach it. So it would be interesting to do a full comparison. I will say the place that does these, like in a systematic way, mass taxpayers used to do through fiscal 2019, I want to say, full comparisons of all the cities and towns, including that measure. And for whatever reason, they haven't done it in 3 or 4 years. But if you wanted to look back, I think they have it through fiscal 19.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
Did you look at an analysis of like the last 3 or 4 years in Somerville around new growth? Is this a pattern or is this an anomaly?
So I leave that to the experts, other experts in the room. Did you want to answer?
I'll probably address the revenue question in my presentation, but Revenues, of course, have been growing. New growth in particular has escalated considerably and will continue to escalate. And I'll probably show you a chart when I do my presentation.
Thanks so much for your presentation. Mass Taxpayers was my least favorite advocacy group to work with when I did statewide budget advocacy in the legislature. Just a quick question about comparisons, and this is actually in Director Bean's presentation, so but I assume you have this number off the top of your head. So just looking at the tax levy, 19 million below our municipal tax levy. Were other municipalities that you compared similarly below their tax levy?
Comparing what years now?
This fiscal year, so in
20
the presentation that we are going to be getting today.
23 and 22. So I didn't look.
Okay.
I'll address that in my presentation. We're not 19.6 below the tax levy. That's the potential for fiscal 2023.
Right, raising to the tax levy, I should say. Well, so then my follow-up question is, are there comparable municipalities that are similarly not at their limit that you were either able to compare or were not comparing?
Oh, you mean but the reason it would go up that much, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is because of new growth, because you get 2.5%, right? So you're always going to go up at least 2.5%.
Is 82, Arlington is 42, so that gives you a, no surprise.
So yeah, if that's 59,000, it's the same.
Yeah. So, just an interesting data point, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, because the total revenue size, as you say, as you rightly know, it's mostly a population measure, right? They're not raising a lot more revenue principally because, or a lot less, principally because of the value of property. It's principally because of the number of people there. And you'd want, as you say, like a per capita measure for that comparison.
Or, Brookline has a lot of, revenue per capita for the capita it has. Okay.
I will say, in terms of like what I was surprised by in the new growth, I'm surprised at how little new growth revenue there is in Brookline. Like, had you asked me in advance before I put this together, I would have guessed higher. Testament to growth at Somerville. All right, next. So, as you know, city spending supports a range of services and personnel. The biggest share of the budget goes to salaries and benefits. Running a city well requires a lot of highly skilled people who need to be fairly compensated lest they stop helping a city run well. Another meaningful portion goes, so the biggest portion goes to salaries and benefits. Another big portion goes to equipment and materials, technology, snow removal, elections, and just insurance, and stuff like that. And then the last big chunk goes to kind of long-term obligations that we've talked about. We'll go through this. I should say this is the beginning of like 3 or 4 slides that talk about revenue. It's not revenue, spending in FY22 Somerville budget. So here it is, broken out by department. You see the biggest chunk goes to schools. Public safety is next. That includes, obviously, police and fire are the 2 big items in there, split about evenly. But then pensions and fringe is $45 million. It's another very large tranche. Debt service at $20 million. Thoughts on this? So this actually harkens back, I should have said. If you go back 2 slides, and I just said a substantial amount is devoted to long-term obligations. This forward 2 slides. This is long-term obligations. So I wanted to spend a little more time with this because it's just a really important point to think about how much is already spoken for because of these obligations that you enter every year already owing. So it includes kind of assessments for things like the MBTA, MAPC, which is a big planning agency, multi-city planning agency, charter school attendance. There are debt service costs for capital projects, that some from the past, some currently. We talked about pension obligations, so there's pre-funding and pension obligations. And together, these amount to 10 to 20% of all budgeted spending. You saw from the previous slide, debt service alone is $20 million. That's a big chunk, and it's going to be there. It's a big chunk, and I should say, it's not a problem. It's a big part of what a city needs to do. You need to raise capital to take on big projects, and then you pay back that capital over time, and you build up debts. Debt spending is a healthy part of a budget. There's another way to think about these kinds of fixed costs, or the pieces of a budget that are in place and kind of fixed before you even start thinking about where you want to spend your money. So these are quite separate here, but let's start with the top one. Personal services, that's salary and fringe, salary and benefits. So 2/3 of the budget is salary and benefits. And a quarter is, maintenance. So that's more stuff, tech, equipment, roads, special items. I assume the catch-all for everything else. And then here, another way to think about kind of fixed costs. Health insurance costs alone, $25 million out of a $300 million in revenue. Pensions, debt service, and additional debt service and exclusion. That's like $60 million in total. That is kind of spoken for when this process begins. Oh, more than that, because that's just the insurance, that doesn't even count the salaries. So just these 4. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, stick with that. So thoughts on I know Ed's going to talk more about spending stuff, but thoughts on the spending stuff? Yeah.
So maybe you answer this, but the excluded debt service, is that like for the high school, like the Prop 2.5
Yes.
override? And how much do we bring in with that 2.5 override? Like how much are we bringing in?
Do you know the total from
I didn't see it up there in the other.
Okay. So it's equivalent to what you're seeing here, the amounts in the overrides, yeah.
But so the overall amount of revenue that we're bringing in, it comes out of that? Or is it a separate cash flow?
It's property tax, additional property tax
So
revenue.
it comes out of the main.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
Thank you.
So,
I have a question. So I see here 4.5% of our budget is debt service. I know people toss around kind of various best practices for what to keep that number below. Do you have thoughts on kind of what's the red zone?
Way above this.
But specifically?
Where do you get in trouble with ratings agencies with debt service? Double digits?
Yeah, so our standard is 7%, so we're well below that. You get to 10%, then you are definitely in the red zone with the bond rating agencies.
Okay,
So-
but the external expert says we could go double digits.
No, I'm saying that's.
No, he says that's where you get in trouble.
I said double digits is
Well,
where you cut off.
If you want to do another debt exclusion, we could do that.
Man, I got sucked into that.
No, I think the reason I think it's important is because this is kind of one of the values questions that we often talk about is kind of the potential gains of debt spending, right? Of borrowing money when rates are good and committing that money to things we care about.
Yeah.
It take a long time to pay off, and that could be a policy choice, and we are in a very safe position currently.
You're in a very healthy position in terms of the debts that you're carrying right now. When you every time you consider taking on more debt, you have to consider the macroeconomic risk and the environment that you're in, and that's changing pretty fast. But yeah, 4.5% is something that the rating agencies will tell you. So that's the other thing. You sort of don't have to guess. If you are interested in taking on a lot more debt, they'll let you know very quickly when they get worried about it. Okay, so last little bit. Oh, sorry, no question.
Thank you. I actually want to go back a couple slides. This all hit me
This one?
like a bunch of bricks, because I hadn't had a chance to review it. No, even further back to the revenue page. We're just going to go way, way back.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
So, just trying to understand in some of the projections that you gave us, looking at bullet point number 4, it includes things like ARPA. Are other municipalities factoring ARPA into their, for lack of a better term, traditional fiscal budget? Or are they using that as kind of a pot of cash that exists somewhere else that is not factored into the traditional fiscal year budget?
If they're doing it right, they're not factoring it into their traditional budget. It is a very different it's a very different pot of money. And I have seen towns where they will talk about, they'll bring their current year ARPA spending into a picture of the budget, which I understand if you want to share with people, share with your constituents or residents. But it obviously has a totally different set of constraints attached to it and needs to be thought of separately.
And just to follow up, and you can go all the way back to that slide that had the comparisons with bond ratings. Have you seen other...
That's forward.
Oh,
Yeah,
forward,
yeah.
sorry, excuse me. Long day. Have you seen other municipalities, actually just keep going. One more slide, one more slide, one more slide, one more slide. Yes. Have you seen other municipalities use ARPA funds for capital projects to offset potential debt services? And if so, how have the bond rating companies taken to that approach?
The restrictions around ARPA make it complicated even to use it for water, sewer, and broadband capital projects.
Got it.
So even there, it's tricky to use for lots of things. If you have a water and sewer based capital project, then ARPA is a candidate. And again, I'm not a political you're the political representatives, right? I'm not a political representative. But then ARPA money might make sense. But the reason there aren't a lot of, you asked me if I've seen a lot of, the reason there aren't a lot of examples is because there aren't a lot of available capital uses. And towns that I've talked to have been struggling to find the best uses. And there are other kind of you have to be sure to use it for one-time uses, right? That's the key thing. But they're finding other kind of one-time ways to spend it. Because it can be tricky to navigate allowable capital spending.
Got it. Lots more questions, but I'll hang back till later.
Yeah. Okay, so the one thing I really wanted to, I mentioned the macroeconomic environment. The one really unique feature of this coming budget year that is really vital to think about and understand is inflation. We have not had, I just wrote about this and I'll just quote, I'll use the same reference that I did there because I can't help myself. We haven't really had to deal with inflation like this since baby boomers were in their 30s. That's a long time ago. And that's where we are. We have inflation at somewhere between 6 and 8% right now. That is totally different than an environment where we have inflation at 2 or 3%. And it changes the pressures on the budget in a really meaningful way. It means, well, most basically, everything is getting more expensive. That's what inflation means. So just maintaining city services. If you want to do the same things you were doing in FY22, it's going to take a lot more kind of raw dollars to do it because it's more expensive to hire people, it's more expensive to build things, it's more expensive to heat buildings, right? All of these things have gotten more expensive. Also, inflation is going to change the dynamics of union negotiations. For obvious reasons, wages have to go, well, the position will be that wages will need to go up to account for the fact that the value of those wages has been eroded by inflation and eroded pretty substantially. So the likelihood is that union contracts are going to get more expensive. It's important to have property appraisals that reflect current costs, right? Property values are changing or have changed really dramatically in the last 2 years. That makes a big difference. Less than an upside, which is that your debt obligations in dollar terms are cheaper. Like if you owe someone $1, that dollar has less value than effectively you owe them less money. So inflation has this benefit for debt, but it creates all these additional costs, and it makes FY23 really unique. I see people have questions.
I had a question about the inflation. How long should this all the words coming out of my mouth at the same time from my brain. How long should the city plan for inflation rates? How many budget seasons?
Okay, if I knew a definitive answer to that, I would be making big bucks somewhere else. But my sense is probably this is the last budget season like this. But not for good reason. It's the last budget season like this because the Federal Reserve is going to damage the economy sufficiently to drive down inflation rates. So I think inflation will be a much less of a problem in FY24, but there will be other problems as a consequence. That's my not so cheery.
On that, what would be the forecast of potential problems?
The labor market is going to get weaker, basically. Jobs will be slightly more difficult to come by. House prices probably going to stagnate. Capital gains revenue, you don't care about capital gains revenue. From the state perspective, capital gains revenue is going to stagnate. So there'll be challenges, but that's the position they're in to fight inflation. So you're asking my macroeconomic view. Yeah, I think this is the last year you'll face inflation rates like this, and probably closer to 3 or 4% heading into FY24. Okay, last slide is this kind of next steps and the role of the city council. Again, politics is not my area of expertise, but I do know that you play a really vital role in the budget process, and I'm hoping this information helps through deliberations. In particular, my understanding anyway is that US council members can approve or reduce the mayor's proposed budget, that you can also make resolutions that reflect your priorities. And if you do that in a timely way, those resolutions can be reflected in the budget itself. And that, because, as was said earlier, a budget is a kind of moral document, is a document of values and trade-offs, it's important to have kind of thought partners on difficult issues for around these trade-offs, helping to ensure that constituent voices are heard. It's a weighty and important role, and I hope going through this was at least somewhat useful for thinking about these kinds of challenges. I'll take any last questions. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. So
Testing. If I can see it. I guess my goal is to try to put some numbers behind these concepts and give you a sense of where we're at right now, what we might be facing going forward into fiscal 2023. Evan's covered this. It's the composition of the 202 budget, 287.5 million, the breakdown, which you've already seen. Next. And just to get a sense of where we stand here in fiscal 2022, based on our ledger reports, we're doing very well. At least we are not in danger of being in deficit, with only a couple of exceptions. So we've spent down as of May 13th. I guess I'm going to come out here. I can't really see this.
Director Bean, I'm being told that you can't be heard by members of the public. I guess probably you should just use this microphone here.
I'm going to try. Well, I'm going to try to do this, and my back's going to be too. I'm sorry about that. But so at this particular point in time, we've expended 81.2% of the non-school appropriations and 85.79% of the school department appropriations. So based on these numbers, it seems like the school department will pretty much spend down their entire appropriation. On the city side, we're on a straight line basis, we'd probably be about 85%. So we're underexpending at this particular point in time. On the ordinary maintenance side, we're pretty much at 85%. It's on the PS side, the personal services, because what we've seen in the last few years is a lot of lag money on the personal services side based on the difficulty in hiring positions in this labor market. So we will run a surplus on the general fund. It's hard to predict exactly how much it will be at this particular point in time until we close out the fiscal year and reconcile the vendor contracts. Next one. The two situations where we have deficits in the council, with your help, we've corrected this one, was in the fire department. The fire department overtime was significantly over budget with the factors of 10 staff vacancies, COVID, firefighters work in very close proximity, injuries, vacations. The fire department transferred $780,000 from their salary accounts to the overtime account, and you just recently appropriated $500,000 in free cash to remedy this deficit, and that should sustain them through June 30th. The only other situation on the ledger, departmental, next slide, would be snow removal. And the snow removal deficit, and snow removal is the only account that can legally run a deficit. There are 8 snow events throughout the city during the year. Deficit is $442,933. DPW tells me that they should be able to remediate that deficit by a transfer within DPW, which the council will have to approve, likely from the sanitation department.
Sorry, Director Bean, question right here.
Yes.
We had a pretty average year snowfall-wise, but we did have the one really big snow event. Is that why we ended up with such a deficit, because of how the snow came?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, yes, one event, and DPW will explain this when they come before you, did account for a great deal of the deficit. And of course, the snow removal is a combination of city workers and outside contractors.
Director, looks like you got another.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, thank you, Director Bean. So this is deficits on the general fund ledger, but things that were grant funded or reimbursed from MEPA wouldn't show up on the general fund ledger, right? They would have been journaled out and reimbursed, correct?
That's correct.
All right, so I believe from one of our last couple finance meetings, you mentioned that police overtime expenses have been something we've been able to get MEPA reimbursement for, but fire department had not been, is that right?
Through you, I'm looking for Kate Harkey's. We try to maximize reimbursement from FEMA as best we possibly can. And Kate, have we been reimbursed for police? I know we are struggling to get a reimbursement for fire overtime from FEMA.
That's correct. The fire department overtime costs were being held up in review. We did not submit a lot of police costs to FEMA for reimbursement this year. They just didn't have the volume as fire did.
Could we get a number on that for the future? All right, appreciate that. Would there be any other reimbursement or grant funding streams that would be off book or off the general fund ledger for police department salaries or overtime?
There might have been a smaller, it's called EOPS, the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. I think they received under $100,000 this year for overtime costs. It may have been 68,000, or that might have been last year, but there were some numbers there too. And then if they had other grant funds, I don't know. I didn't work on those.
All right, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm sure there'll be many. This is the revenue composition for the general fund for fiscal year 22, which was covered by Evan. Next. So this is the revenue performance here in fiscal 22. We have already exceeded our revenue budget as of May 10th. As you can see, we're up by $1.7 million. And you can see the various categories. I think that, it's been difficult to estimate revenues in the last few years. Back in fiscal 20, we actually did not meet our revenue target. We were at 99.4% during the pandemic, but that we consider that to be very, very good. We had a very good year last year. And so we certainly will be running a fairly decent surplus by June 30th. With 6 weeks to go on the revenue side. So we're in a good position revenue-wise, and we will underexpend the general fund. So we will be running an operating surplus. Sure.
Hello? Wow, it's very loud. Through you, Chair, to Director Bean, a couple of quick questions. So I'm looking at fees as well as licenses and permits. Budgeted, wow, much lower than what we collected. That's about $15 million simply in the licenses and permits line item alone. Could you just talk, one, a little bit about where that came from?
Yes, next slide, actually.
Oh, wonderful, great. But I have a follow-up question on that as well. Were those $15 million or so put into free cash? Like where were those put once we've collected all of them?
If we exceed our revenue budget, yes, monies flow to free cash and then get appropriated. So that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think the key thing is to estimate revenues reasonably conservatively. That's the DOR framework. But the big generator on the fees and the permits is the building permits. Mm-hmm. So you can see the significant variance over budget projection to revenue to date. And this is a variable revenue source. We budgeted 8.5 this year. I think we were surprised at all of the developments coming in. And the important thing about budget building permits, and we've been saying this a while, is we've been trying to budget it roughly at 5.5. We did bring it up to 8.5 this year. Because there's a variable revenue source, there's a pipeline. That pipeline is probably a couple more years down the line. But you do want to budget conservatively on this because, if we had budgeted 23, obviously we'd have a real problem here going into the next fiscal year on a particular base. So the estimate I think we're going to do for fiscal 2023, at least at this point, and I just want to stress we still have 6 weeks to go. We haven't made all of our decisions. Is probably going to be 5.5. In all likelihood, we'll probably get more than 5.5, but we're certainly not going to get, we might get up to 8.5, but the key situation here is that you have long-term consequences if you don't budget conservatively. But this is the situation. We can see what's been happening here the last few years. 2019, 10 million, and then go down to 7.5, and then 9.4. So we should be getting some significant building permit revenue for at least the next couple of years, according to OSPCD and the planners.
So just a couple quick follow-ups on that. You had come to a previous finance committee meeting and mentioned that there were 24 million in free cash. Does that include the 15 million that is estimated in additional licenses and permit fees?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, that's going to be next year's, whatever the surplus is, and whatever your surplus is on the appropriation side. The formula is a lot more complicated than that, takes in a whole bunch of other factors, and DOR certifies based on the balance sheet that we present to them. So that would, we will probably have a fairly good free cash situation when certified, which will be probably in October or November, once we close the books in the balance sheet. But yes, this is record free cash that we have this year, and we're gonna need to come back to you before June 30th, because free cash goes away on June 30th. So it's an opportunity to appropriate that free cash to all sorts of stabilization funds or whatnot for all sorts of different purposes. And, you know, the mayor and I will be discussing a plan to do that certainly in the next week or two and come back to you.
Wonderful. I think we had at least 24 million in ideas from our council process.
Yes.
Just a couple of clarifying questions on the numbers that you've got right in front of us. So what I'm looking at, it's hard because I just got this presentation today. This 8.5 million, what you said is we typically would have a budget projection of around 5.5 million. So you're anticipating to come before the council with a budget projection of building permits of about 5.5. Did I understand what you just said correctly?
In all likelihood, we hope it will be more, and it probably will be more, but we're not certain that it will be more. You know, it's just the uncertainty that you worry about. Yeah.
Of course, and this is maybe a question for after this meeting, but if you could provide us with the revenue year-to-date building permit of the previous 2 fiscal years, that would be very helpful. If it's similarly astronomically high, 3 times what is budgeted for, 4 times what is budgeted for, I would definitely be curious in us having a kind of deeper conversation around.
Well, I can tell you we budgeted 5.8 in fiscal 21, 5.5 in 20, 5.5 in 19, 8.5 in fiscal 18, 5.6 in fiscal 17.
I'm going to hand over the mic. We're definitely going to have fun discussions in budget season, because that 24 number is real big.
Sure.
I had it first, thank you. No, it's okay. Through you, Mr. Chair, and sorry to my colleague, Councilor Klingon, I'm sure this is not the first time you've had your hand slapped in a classroom. I wasn't there, I'm just guessing. Yeah, on this point, just really briefly, are we expecting that there are gonna be less projects in the pipeline next year here for the building fees? Because I know from a slide that's coming up that we're expecting a reduction in revenue from building fees, and I am curious about below the 8.5, which we got this year. So are we expecting just like less than what we expected this year, which we almost tripled?
It will be less based on and we rely on OSP, CD, and ISD, obviously, the planners. Again, these are estimates at this point in time. You know, we haven't, when we come to you in a couple of weeks with the final budget, we're going to we're going to re-examine all these revenues. These are estimates at this particular point in time. So I definitely will go back to OSP, CD, and engage them and ISD. There have been times when, I think a few of the councils might remember, 3 or 4 years ago when there was an issue about building permit revenue regarding, was it block? It's an Assembly Square, where, so there was an issue. So it's kind of, I was looking at it in terms of, we need to be conservative, because if these projects don't get approved timely, then you don't have that revenue there. There's a question about one of the projects, and there's a question about whether we're going to meet our budget.
Well, if people say anything about me, it's that I'm conservative. So I can respect that, but I just find it curious that the amount that we projected for this year, which we exceed it exponentially, we're expecting just less than that baseline, even though 2019, we did more than what we projected. 2021, we're doing more than that 8.5. 2020, bad year. I think we can all agree with that. But I look forward to the full report.
And I promise you, we will re-examine this in the next couple of weeks before we make final decisions.
Jesse, did you have a question? No. I'm nice.
Mine's similar to what Councilor Burnley was asking. I'm just curious about, so, because when you've shown us in the past, or Director Golden, when showed us in the past, projecting out, how much of this 23 million would have been coming in for the next fiscal year? Like were building permits just coming in quicker than we had originally thought, or are these just new building permits? Like, did it affect next year's building permit revenue?
My understanding is that it will, yes. There were some that came in. I don't have all the project in front of me specifically, but I think there were some surprises. There were some things that we thought would be in 2023 that did come in 2022. I can go back, we can examine that with OSPCD and ISD and probably have that information for you when we discuss this at budget time.
Okay, thank you.
So looking at this building, you know, your building permits are based on your construction costs, and this is one of a very expensive building. It's a research building. It's one of the highest costing out there. I wouldn't be surprised if it's about $1,000 a square foot or something like that. So one of the things that would help us, I think, folks are very surprised about this number. But I'm not surprised, because if we're building buildings like this shows me why the revenue is unusually high. So it would be nice to get a breakdown of what types of projects, you know, what percentage of that revenue came from mammoths like this, which are the exceptions and not the norm, or understanding, for example, I know Union Square is about to build another research building, you know, which ones are on the pipeline, because I think it will help folks understand. And again, it's all based on projections. Construction costs are, as you very well know, we're looking at inflation, like increases of 20% in 6 quarters, never seen before. So we don't know how this is going to maintain, and we have a workforce to maintain this. But I think it would help, I think, everybody understand. Because this seems, I can understand why people think this is a big number, but this building tells me a big story.
Thank you. I guess I want to point out, like, we are in pretty uncharted territory here in terms of the growth we're seeing here. Do you feel like we're getting a good handle on just how this all fits together in terms of like the pipeline and basically as it goes through here and ends up in new growth and eventually, you know, ends up in our levy? Do we feel like we're getting a handle on that?
I think we do, and we'll talk about the levy in a bit. Assessor Frank Golden is here. We have regular meetings with the planning staff and OSPCD. We rely on them. They have the relationships with the developers, and we're always concerned about the timeline and you know, what is a definite thing and what's going to go through the planning process, the zoning process, that type of thing. So it's obviously a maze to even get to this particular point. So I think we have a really, I think, fairly good sense of where we think the new growth is going to be. You know, you have to have construction documents in terms of building permit revenue, that type of thing, which kind of comes later in the game. So I think we probably have a better sense of where we think the tax revenue is going to be, less so than the building permits, a little bit more variable. Can we move forward? All right.
Can we go back a slide? Please, thank you. I'm curious about the pilot fee, the pilot money. Are we expecting to collect 100% of the pilot money for this fiscal year? I know this is as of May 10th.
Yes, or close to. So Tufts University comes up with a pilot payment of $425,000, but they give it to us in June every year. Of course, I'd like to see it a little earlier. So that 425 should get us close to, and there may still be a few of the small nonprofits coming in. So we will be close to or at the 100%.
And similar question with state revenue. Are we expecting to collect 100% of what's budgeted?
Yes, so state revenue comes in quarters.
Okay.
So the final quarter will be on June 30th.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Through the chair, continuing that line of questioning, but just broadening the scope here. There's a number of items here where we are seeing that we have not collected what is owed to the city. For example, investment income, we're at 61%. Where's the other 40? When's that coming? Is it on the way, or I gotta call a guy? No. And on that point, if we were to collect 100% of the fees and the budget, what would that do? What would that look like for our budget in total? I know it says over here we're 100.61% of budget, and I imagine that's because of items like licenses and permits and other department revenue that are over 200% of their expected value. But I'm curious, is that 100.61% calculating for collecting 100% on all these items, or yes?
Yes. So on investment income, the treasurer is here. That's, first of all, the city can't invest legally in equities or whatnot. It's T-bills, CDs, and that's directly related to interest rates. So we were maybe 900,000 collection out of the treasurer's year like 3 years ago. It's dropped precipitously because interest rates have gone down. Look at what you get on a bank account. That's basically what it is. So that's the reason for the drop in investment income. So as we go through the presentation, certainly we're going to adjust upward estimates on a number of things for fiscal 2023. In particular, some of the economically sensitive revenues. The economy is doing well. I mean, so as we see going forward, and present that to you at budget time. I have some estimates now, but we still have a couple more weeks to go in terms of being how we're going to estimate these things. But I would say that this is a good situation we're in right now to meet our budget here on May 10th. That's a very, very good thing.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. I will just say it's a slight tweak. The economy is doing well for some, and I think particularly the councilors here who've spoken to constituents who will not be here next year do not feel as though the economy is doing that great in a lot of respects. But I will pass it.
Well, I agree with you on that point. Okay, so we wanted to bring this out, and when we talk about things coming back from the pandemic, the meals tax, the restaurant sector, cafes, whatnot, we're pretty much back at pre-pandemic levels on the meals tax. The meals tax is 0.75% of sales. The state gets the other 6.25%. So the meals tax comes in from the state on a quarterly basis. We've got one more quarter to go. We've already met our budget. In the fourth quarter, you'll probably see about 400,000, which would get us close to the 2019 number of 2,182,000. The hotel motels, you see we only collected, because of the pandemic, 419,000 in 2021. We've already collected 1 million. Won't quite get back to pre-pandemic levels, but these sectors are, regaining strength. And all of these accounts are going to be above budget. So, and most of them, we certainly look at adjusting upward in fiscal 2023. All right, so now we're going to take a look at as we move to fiscal 2023, I wanted to summarize the state aid proposals that the legislature is debating at this particular point in time. And just to make sure, to clarify, when we talk about state aid or local aid, this is money that comes from the state budget to the city or town general fund budget to fund all of our services. And that's different from the grants. It's like state categorical grants that don't flow to the general fund. They're sent to us in what is called cherry sheets. The two biggest revenue categories, and I put all of the proposals in the appendix so you can look at each one of the line items. The two biggest revenue items, of course, Chapter 70 state aid and unrestricted general government aid. Those are the receipts, and then the charges are levied against us, biggest ones being MBTA assessment and the charter school tuition. So you've got the details in the back. The important thing to understand is the state is sitting on record tax revenues, $2 billion more than what was projected. And this is engendering debate on Beacon Hill. The governor, his policy has always been to raise unrestricted general government aid at a level that is no more than anticipated growth in state revenues, no more than that. And for us, or for all cities and towns, he's giving an increase of only 2.7% in unrestricted general government aid. This year, last year was 3.5%. The House of Representatives is following suit and only looking for a 2.7% increase. But the state Senate has made it very, very clear that they want to do much better for cities and towns, and they're looking to give us, all cities and towns, a 5.3% increase. This is being debated now at the State House. So if you look at the proposals for Somerville, the Senate proposal would give us an increase of $1,495,000 over our base here in fiscal 2022, as opposed to Baker, Governor Baker in the House, $747,679. There are other accounts whereby the House and Senate do a little bit better on education aid, Chapter 70 aid, than the governor. So that debate is raging right now in Beacon Hill, so that we're betting on getting the Senate proposal. We think the Senate proposal will pass, so we're going to right now estimate the Senate proposal in terms of the state aid next year.
Comment and a question. In all my 10 years doing State House advocacy, typically the budget ends up somewhere in between House Ways and Means and Senate. Governor obviously goes as low as he possibly can. Just a quick question in terms of the date when we would have a pretty finalized sense of what the fiscal year contributions are going to be from the legislature. Obviously, they haven't gone to conference committee on this, and so we have no idea where the House and the Senate's going to land, but we will not have that number until after our budget process, correct?
And that's not unusual.
Yes.
There have been times it's actually been after July 1, as you are fully aware. So this is the problem that we have, localities have in terms of setting their budgets, and why, the longer we wait and prepare, usually the numbers are better. So it's a roll of the dice. So we're going to have to come up, we'll make a judgment in 2 weeks what we're going to put in there, but it's very frustrating. It really is.
Just a comment, I'm going to jump on my soapbox here because this is a favorite pet peeve of mine. I just want to call out how ridiculous it is that we've been in austerity mode since basically 2008 as a state, and just is how ridiculous it is that we have a governor talking about cutting taxes, trying to do sales tax holiday weekends, rather than actually investing in the communities. Thanks.
Okay, so on the negative side, let me just explain to you. This is not cherry sheet aid, but we will receive our final payment of $1.1 million from the state for reimbursement for the Capilano School construction next month in June, and that will be off the books. This is the old scheme of funding school construction. This is going way, way back. Now the MSBA gives you the money right up front. Years ago, it would be amortized over 20 or 30 years. So we're receiving reimbursement for the Capilano School, we're receiving it for the West Somerville Neighborhood School, the Healy School, and this is the final year. So that's booked for this fiscal 2022, so we will lose that next year. Somerville Tax Levy. So I think we're going to try to walk through these levy questions if we can. So the fiscal 202 levy, let me put my glasses on. Sorry. It's hard to- Levy, the full levy is $200,839,915. So the way we have to report to the Department of Revenue, what was inside the levy limit is that $194,806. Outside the levy limit, which is debt exclusion, as we know, is the Somerville High School, and that funds the debt service of $6,033,610. Next slide. All right, to answer the question that Councilor Kelly asked, we were 3.2 million below the levy limit, and the reason for that is we had predicated the budget on 9.5 million in new growth. New growth is certified by the Department of Revenue. They certified it in the late fall, and it actually came in at 10.7. And you factor in the appropriation cuts made by the council and whatnot. So you can only use that levy capacity up until recap time, when you set the tax rate in December. So we got the news in the late fall. The previous administration did not decide to use that additional levy capacity up until the recap time. So we look at, we're 3.2 million below levy now. So if we look at the calculation, the levy limit for 2022 is 198,051,137. So the way the formula works, you add 2.5%, which is your Proposition 2.5 increase. That comes to 4,951,278. Then the good news is that the new growth is being projected at 11,500,000, which again is a record. So we're going from 10.7 to 11.5. Adding on that. So at that point, the maximum allowable levy inside the debt limit would be 214,502,415. You got to add on the debt exclusion of 6,600,000. But you're going to be comparing the maximum allowable levy inside the debt limit of 214,502 to what we taxed in this particular fiscal year. I guess, is the next slide? So the difference there is going to be the 19.6 million is the possible potential ability to tax on the property tax for fiscal 2023, assuming we went to the full Proposition 2.5 debt limit. Okay? This shows you the new growth. You can see the big, huge jumps even from fiscal year 19. So Frank Golden, the assessor, is here. He is projecting that this will continue in fiscal 24, 25. We should see increases. They're probably conservative increases, but this pattern should continue for several more years. So on the share of the tax levy, currently the residential sector is carrying 72.53%, and the commercial and industrial carrying 27.47%. Next. This shows the commercial versus residential share of the levy. And the goal, of course, is to put more of the tax burden on the commercial share as new growth comes in, so that in 2023, you can see there's going to be almost a percentage point jump downward from 72.53 to 71.53, and adding on to the commercial residential share. And that trend should continue when as the commercial growth comes in. Debt service. So we spoke a little bit about this. What we attempted to do was to expedite the borrowing for the city. We knew the Fed was going to meet, and we knew the Fed was going to raise interest rates to counter inflation. So we actually borrowed in late April as opposed to when we usually borrow, which is around this time in May. So we figured it would be worse, but nevertheless, the rates did rise dramatically in the one-year period, going from 1.99% to 3.58% on long-term debt, and on the short-term debt, less than 1%, 0.12% as compared to 2.2% now. So these are dramatic increases. We went out, we borrowed $109.1 million here, and we converted 17.1 to from short-term debt to long-term debt. So this has ramifications. You'll see that with the ramifications on fiscal 2023, but on the long term, of course, if interest rates stay at this rate, it does constrain us in our ability to fund capital projects down the line. Is there a question? Sorry.
Thank you. You might be about to get to this, but just in terms of the strategy, in terms of borrowing, are we looking at sort of hitting the pause button on any big capital improvement projects just while we're fighting inflation here with higher rates? Or is that not necessarily something we have to be concerned about?
I think the question is going to be is what capital projects do we fund? Because, you know, in front of us, we've got probably $500 million worth of proposals, all sorts of things. So we have to make decisions on what our priorities are. We know we're going to have, you can see, continual growth, commercial growth. And we'll know we'll have some capacity within the levy limit going down the line if the growth continues as expected to do. So debt service, of course, is a hit to the general fund. So the question is how much debt service do you want to incur going forward for capital projects? Because that debt service also competes against other priorities that you want to fund with the general fund. So those are the decisions that have to be made, you know, down the line. You know, it hits the operating budget, and do you want capacity? You know, how much capacity do you want to have for capital versus ongoing operating budget needs?
Just to follow up then, so I guess I'm talking in terms of new bonding, new borrowing that we'd be doing. Are you looking at just this weird phase we're in here where we are, you know, the Fed is fighting inflation. They've raised rates pretty substantially. You know, as we heard, you know, that's not going to last. That's not going to last forever. Is your inclination then to be looking to put off as much of that as possible, just until we're at a time where we're out of that phase?
My view is that there are projects that we need to move on. I mean, we absolutely, there's a few big projects to move on, but also to be reminded there's ongoing recurring needs, street reconstruction, building improvements. These are things that, ADA improvements, these are things we have to do, absolutely have to do going forward. So you got to take a look at what is maybe a discretionary capital project versus a solid need that you need to move forward on. So I think, you know, we will be the mayor and I have talked about this, and we're going to be having a lot of discussions after the budget and over the summer to plan out where we think the capital plan should be going forward.
I have a quick question. And when do we start for, like, let's say the high school, we plan it, we are under construction. When do we start accruing the debt service? The minute we open the building?
We already have.
Well, no, I'm saying, but that's, if any project, let's say I'm planning a new Winter Hill School, I'm not gonna accrue by planning or anything debt service now, which takes a while. It's not until I've completed the project that the debt service starts accruing. Is that a correct statement?
No, it's not, because
Okay.
you're borrowing for construction.
So you borrow, okay, that, I didn't know
Yeah.
that was like a short-term thing. Okay,
What we'll do is borrow short term, let's say in the design phase, till we get some more concrete numbers for construction, and they'll move to a long-term situation.
So I'm being really dumb, I'm sorry, because I
So,
do.
no, any and all questions are
No,
appreciated.
I'm trying to understand, because I do it, you know, I come from a different, so the debt service, it even includes the design of the building?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Design and construction you can borrow for, yes.
Okay, that I didn't understand, thank you.
Thank you, through you, Mr. President. I'm not looking to nail anything or anybody down here, but do you have an idea of, like, when you talk about the limit on capital projects, is there like a dollar figure that would go, or is it literally, like, I know you said over the summer and into the fall, you and the mayor are gonna work on what that is, but would we have some sort of idea as to, like, how much money we're talking about, or is that not even a factor, it's more about priority, like what needs to be done or whatnot?
Well, I think, we look at long-term plans, so there will be surpluses going forward, so it really does come down to how much do we want to, I think that's a deeper discussion. So let's say we add a lot of operating budget items to this particular budget, you're gonna have those new things, they're gonna be there succeeding years, so that's gonna eat up capacity. So you have to weigh all of these things together, so I think it's a question of determining what the priorities are on capital projects. I mean, there's certain things, some of these capital projects are bringing in money for the city. I mean, with Union Square, obviously, Boynton Yards coming down the pike. Doing those capital projects will generate more economic development, more money for the city. So those are important. But as I said earlier, you've got to do streets, you got to improve buildings. Is a basic, and we talked about this, the Winter Hill School down the line here. That's a very serious concern that we have to be thinking about.
Good. All right, thank you. I have a few maybe really detailed questions, and I'm sorry if I missed it. So of the 24.8 of long-term debt issuance that isn't rolling over bands, or isn't converting bands, how much of that is perhaps directly attributable to Somerville High School, right? The stuff that would be subject to the debt exclusion.
I'm looking at my deputy auditor here. So on the bands, so at Somerville High School, we did borrow, and that would be under debt exclusion, we did borrow $4.1 million. We wanted to do that in April so we can get the lower rate. Based on the deficit plan that was presented to the council back in November, and we've got to come back to you for discussion. I think that's going to be on Tuesday night, about appropriating other financing sources, non-debt. Our goal is not to borrow more money for the high school above and beyond the 4.1. Now, we do have to borrow short-term for Somerville High School because the MSBA money doesn't necessarily come in quickly. And what MSBA does at the end of the project is they hold a lot of money. It could be $4 or $5 million. And it could be for some time. When these Somerville Community School, it took us 5 years to get our last payment from MSBA. So you got to borrow short term, and then when that money comes in from MSBA, you pay down the short term. So Colleen, how much did we borrow for the high school in short term? This is Colleen Tam, the Deputy City Auditor, by the way. What's that? Roughly $11.8 million. $11.8 million. Short term.
That was in short term. How much in long term went out?
Well, long term was 4.1 in this last borrowing, correct?
No, it was actually $5 million, but the premium kind of went down to $4.9 million. So the net cost of the amount that we got ended up being roughly $4.9 million.
Okay, so what she's saying is we received a premium, so we netted it down.
All right, great. So I guess the other piece is, so I heard, but now the number flew out of my head already, how much was short-term ban off that. Of the short-term ban of $67.2 million that went out in May, how much of that is rolled over short-term, rolled over bans, like bans that we have been just continuing to renew at the
Sure.
lower rates, and how much of it is new commitments that
Well-
we're parking in bands until we can get to long-term debt.
Well, we tried to convert as much as we could to long-term, so let's understand what the 67 is. With diff, much of this relates to the Union Square diff, 49 million of that is directly related to Union Square diff. And with the diff plan is you're borrowing short-term for 5 years and then going long-term. So that is, and that's the strategy, so we kept on that. Another, as Colleen said, another 11.8 of the short-term is the high school. The rest is about 6.2, and those are for projects in a design stage, or very, very early on. And so everything else, we sat down and said we're going long-term. We don't want to carry these things any longer.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I'm sure we'll get a spreadsheet with kind of the broad categories of what projects our bands are associated with, including the Union Square diff. I hope I can have a sit down with you, perhaps have an item in Finance Committee, Mr. Chair, not that we don't have other things to do there. But I have received a lot of questions from constituents, particularly about the Union Square diff and how we're directing those bond revenues or the anticipated revenues, which is the point of it. So I really appreciate this, though.
Thank you. So, but luckily, a lot of debt fell off. We were in a year that debt closed out over time. And I believe we reduced, we had about $1.8 million drop off in debt. And we added, I think, about $1.9 million. So on the general fund, the increase is actually pretty minimal, as you can see. With the high school, we just talked about the borrowing, 4.1 and the $11 million ban. So this adds to the debt exclusion by 569,254. So the total debt increase is going to be 639,523 on the general fund. Now the numbers we gave you previously about what we borrowed also include water sewer projects, which you'll see debt service on the enterprise funds when that's presented to you for the budget. And as I said, these are fees that we certainly will estimate upward during the budget to grab us some more revenue. As we said earlier, we're looking to drop, we'll evaluate that. We're looking to drop from 8.5 million on building permits to 5.5. Next. All right, so what it comes down to is assuming that we tax at the Proposition 2.5 limit. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, sorry. Can we go back a slide?
Oh, sure.
Just quick questions in regards to permits and fees. I'm biased around this subject matter. Was there any noticeable impact in terms of considering for FY23 in regards to permits and fees related to restaurants and outdoor dining? I know that there's been substantial, in effect, subsidizing of our restaurant industry given the COVID. Do we have an estimate of what funding we would not receive in revenue based on that?
For 2022, you mean? I can get you some fees will waive in fiscal 2022. Our thinking right now is to waive the retail food permits in 2023, which brings in about 250,000 in revenue. We'll look back, but we did waive, say, some outdoor parking and outdoor activities here in 2022. I don't have all those numbers in front of me, but I can. We're significantly more in fiscal 2021, in the midst of the pandemic.
2 follow-up questions. One, so just to understand you clearly, we did that because we knew those businesses are struggling potentially under the weight of everything that was going on over the last 2 years, and the money was effectively negligible in the grand scheme of the budget. Is that correct?
Well, going back to fiscal 2021, I believe it was about $750,000 that was waived. If my memory serves me correctly, it included fees generated by the city clerk and ISD and whatnot. We didn't do that here in 2022. There were a few fees that were waived. I'll have to go back and look at that.
Okay. This next point, some of my colleagues will recognize from a previous meeting. Would the administration be, open to waiving some other permits and fees, particularly in this case, for a year in regards to what are classified as body art establishments? I've been kind of beating the drum on the issue of tattoo inequity. Somerville permits and fees are about 4 times what they cost in Boston in regards to body art establishments, and about 8 times that what they cost in Cambridge. For what I can see is no discernible reason beyond that our fees around this particular business are outdated. This is regulated through the Board of Health, which means that the council cannot directly do anything about this. The administration can. Health and Human Services advises the Board of Health, but they were not able to advise them quickly enough to help usher in a solution during this month, during the meeting that began at 6 o'clock today, which some of you may have heard me being on. And the effect of that means that these businesses will have to most likely pay this comparatively exorbitant fee to the city to renew. And given that we are in a position of new growth, and then given that we've waived hundreds of thousands of dollars for certain businesses, I'm curious about the administration's position on whether we could do that for this particular year for these establishments as we seek to potentially restructure the permitting fees there, because otherwise it would mean we would cause what are in effect maybe 2 to 3 businesses, not by any means the scale of our restaurant businesses, to have to pay 8 times what they could make or what they would be charged in a neighboring municipality.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So by law, we can't charge a fee more than it costs to administer that fee. So, and department heads have the ability, unless the ordinances say differently, to raise fee and permits. We adopted a statute years ago, allows them to do that. So, I mean, I'm happy to take a look at this and have conversations. I haven't heard about this one, but we'll take a look at, see if it's, first of all, whether they're charging above cost. That's the first question that would be looked at analytically. And when you say that other communities are charging far less, well, that is of interest to you to take a look.
Everyone that I can see, Cambridge, Boston, Salem. And not only are we charging more where other cities have separate licenses that Somerville, for some reason, does not have on the books, what is called a temporary license. So in other municipalities, folks come for a brief time to do some tattoos, and they get to pay a reduced fee for that license, or that permit, I should say. Somerville, we don't have that, meaning these people have to get an annual, a year-long permit for what could be, in effect, a couple of days' worth. And I just want to bring that up because that cycle is starting again, and the administration has the ability to, as we've seen, waive that for a period of time. And I think it could be one way to serve struggling businesses.
Okay, thank you.
I want to piggyback on what my colleague just expressed and take it a slightly different direction. I'm actually concerned about just precedents of waiving these fees and just setting the precedent that businesses would expect this to happen. It sounds like you're doing some accounting of the cost of waiving these. I'm probably barking up the wrong tree here. I hope that businesses are having expressed to them the value of what was waived for them, and that it's being made clear to them that, this is a one-off situation, just due to the really extenuating circumstances that we're in.
Go to the next one. Okay, so at least the estimates now, and like I say, we have a couple more weeks to look at estimates. We can look at the state aid, obviously, make a decision on that. Take a look at any of the revenues that come in. And reducing the building permit line by 3 million. So if you tax the Proposition 2.5 limit and looking, and I've got, I have my own estimates and spreadsheets, we have the ability to raise an additional 19.6 million above and beyond the fiscal 202 revenue basis, which is 6.8% increase. Next. Okay, so now we're just looking at the appropriations side, and just want to lay out the fact that obviously a key, as was said earlier, cost is the cost of employees, in terms of personal services. So we want to note that the following contracts expired on June 30th of 2021. That's the Police Employees Association, Police Superior Officer Association. Those contracts are still out. And that all of the SMEA units and the school custodians contract expire on June 30th. So in terms of how we budget, our base level budget, level service budget, includes any salary step, union contractual salary steps, as well as any non-union step increases based on the salary classification plan. That would be in the departmental budgets. The monies that we hold for negotiations, we put into an account called the salary contingency account. And we budgeted that in fiscal 2022 at $1,726,678. And we're going to use that number, level fund that in fiscal 2023, so that if contracts get negotiated that are pending, then we would be drawing from that pool of money. If that doesn't happen, let's say you get to June 30th, and we'll have that situation now, what we do is we come back to you and transfer that excess salary contingency money into a stabilization fund to hold it, salary stabilization fund to fund these contracts going forward. That's how it works. So right now, the estimate on the just in salaries alone for the base budget for fiscal 2003 would be an increase of $4,043,885.
Director Bean,
Yes.
a couple questions. Contracts currently pending. We had a Somerville Superior Officer's contract come before the Finance Committee. I'm a little bit confused. I thought that was settled. Was that just the previous 3 years? So we are now renegotiating the upcoming 3 years. Okay,
yes,
got it.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you for that clarification.
It took a long time to get that contract even to that point.
Yes, of course. Are we in negotiations with any of the SMEA units currently?
I don't know that, I don't know the answer to that question. I know that we're in the proposal formulation stage, that I do know. So I don't know that, I'm not on the bargaining team, but I'm sure we'll report out where we are at that.
Got it. For the budget presentation that'll come in a couple weeks, it might be helpful for us to just know who we're sitting at the table with currently, who are we actively bargaining with, and then a couple of other follow-up questions. So this is many slides in, but the school department budget lists a 10% increase, but I know that we are currently in contract negotiations with the educators union. Was that factored into this $4 million salary line item increase, or is that?
No.
Okay, great.
But this is purely on the city side. So as you know, we can't control the negotiation. The school committee is empowered to do that.
Totally. I think that was all my questions.
Some questions over here as well.
I'll be the rose for a minute.
I have a question is when we're looking at labor and personal services, to what extent are we gonna start adjusting our salaries to energy savings, folks? To what extent are we gonna have to adjust salary, it's a very competitive labor market out
Yes.
there. Certain jobs, like more related to sort of construction, et cetera, are gonna demand more pay, and I think that's reasonable. Are we accounting for that here? When we look at, and we also have had a hard time hiring as well. How is that gonna be reflected in the budget, or is that to be seen?
That's to be going forward, and I've been working for the city for 32 years. I've never seen a situation in my tenure in terms of difficulty hiring people, given this labor market. And that's one reason we have all this salary lag money that is unspent in the general fund budget. So the city has a crying need, and it was budgeted to do a salary classification plan, a study. And that is, we're, intending to do that, and the HR director can probably report to you on that at budget time, but there's a crying need to take a look at all of these salaries. We clearly are not competitive in many areas.
Oh, I'm really pleased to hear that, thank you.
Actually, related to that question, I see the salaries classification plan. Do non-union staff get COLA adjustments every year? And the second part of the question is that adjusted for inflation?
We have a salary step scale that can be adjusted every single year. So I think the plan is a two-step increase on the salary classification step scale, and that would be roughly equivalent to 4%.
With inflation being what it is, that if we're not reaching 6% or more, it's not really an increase.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot my questions.
Back at it, okay. Salary contingency budget. You've been with the city far longer than I have, and we'll see if I make it that long.
Probably longer than you've been alive, too.
Well, yeah, there's that. I don't like to talk about that, but that's true. What? Yes. 30, we're not 30 yet, okay.
I wish we were your age.
Well, yeah, it's okay. Well, anyway. The salary contingency budget, is that usually fully spent throughout the year, or is it typical for us to have money lying around after?
We will have money, because it comes down to is how quickly can these contracts be negotiated? I mean, we just talked about the police, and what is that, 5 years or so to negotiate? So what we want to do is we don't want to lose that money, so we're going to come back to you in June, whatever the balance is, ask you to transfer that money to this salary stabilization fund, so it's preserved. So we do have a negotiated settlement that we'll have the money for the back years. So what we try to budget here is current year, whatever the current year expense would be on the contracts. In the back years, you go to the salary and wage stab, pay it out of that.
Do you know the history at all? And I don't, so I'm actually asking. Do you know the history at all on how the salary step scale came to be? Because it's alternative path for the non-union workers.
Well, the history would be is the city retained the Collins Center on 2 separate occasions, starting I think in 2012, I think it was 2016. An outside group that evaluated all of the positions, looked at the market situations, comparable communities, and came up with the plan.
Did they look at the council at all?
Yes, they did, actually.
And what was their suggestion around that, if any? Was that 2016, 2017, I remember that.
That's right.
Okay. Can they look again? Because.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Within the context of the study.
Is this a conversation that is happening?
It's in the context of the study. In the coming year, there'll be a compensation study, and it's looking at all positions.
Okay, because I will just point out, I have a friend in Cambridge, his name is Burhan Azim, who's a city councilor. He was just in a magazine because he was a renter trying to find a place to live, like so many other people, and he couldn't find a place to live. And he couldn't find a place that meets his budget. His budget is $86,000. Somerville budget, a mile away in some parts, is less than half of that. And when we look at area median income, we make, I don't know, let's say 30% of area median income. So I'm curious about how we could get, I don't know, 50% of area median income as our city becomes increasingly expensive, unaffordable, and folks who are renters are pushed out. It's my view that having a city represented by folks who are in the same economic class as the vast majority of people in the city is beneficial for government, and we obviously have some barriers to work through there, and I plan to pursue those barriers, and I would love to see that report. I was not in Somerville at the time that it was that process began, but I plan to be for a little bit longer at the very least, so hoping that we can make progress there.
Quick question, and please, if it's not related to this. When someone gets hired, let's say I have two people in the same position, and someone comes in new and they ask for a higher set, we're trying to hire them, and maybe this can't happen. They're at a higher grade salary. Does that other person's salary get adjusted, or it just can't happen? The rules are such that you can never do that. And I can take this offline because I think it's.
I don't know the answer to the question. I will say that as long as it's within the same grade and the money is there, then they could, bring them to a higher step. We hire people, I think, at step 4. I think we're planning to change that and hire at step 5, beginning of next fiscal year. In terms of comparable to another, I don't know the answer to that question. We'll have to look into that.
Councilor Klingel?
Thank you, through you, Mr. President. So, Mr. Bean, does this 1.7 number, this is for retro, you said, right? This is for like when they're settled, that the money, the salary contingency, that's mostly for retro? Like
Yes,
for
whenever it's
when
settled.
the client's settled, right. So, but does this number, like, you feel completely safe with that number? Like, does that give anything away to like anybody? Like, so that's definitely gonna cover like whatever increases? I know you can come back to us anyway, but I'm just saying, what is this number? Like, how did you come to this 1.726 number?
Well, we estimate, for various unions that are out there. Now, I can't, we couldn't talk about this in open session, obviously. We'd have to go into executive session because that would impair the labor relations strategy. But we're looking at certain costs. We're also looking at the overtime costs in those particular departments. It should cover, we believe, I basically created both the salary contingency and salary stabilization accounts years ago because the city didn't do this, You settle a contract, then you're gonna run for free cash or someplace else. So this is important with the bond rating agencies as well. They wanna see that you are covering your contractual obligations in prospective contract negotiations. So we haven't had a problem with funding contracts, either via salary contingency or salary stabilization, at least not in my tenure.
Thank you, thank you, I appreciate that, and it just seems like it gives away something, I don't know, gives away some sort of, negotiating, ideas, from one side, but anyway, thank you.
Any other questions on this? We move forward? Okay, we talked about health insurance costs. So this is one cost that we don't have final numbers in on. And the reason being is that the open enrollment ended in early May and the HR department is still calculating. We would note that the average premium increase by the GIC was a little bit higher this year, 6.2%. And the last few years, in fact, 5.8 last year, 3.8 in fiscal 2020. Right now, we're estimating an appropriation increase of about $750,000 to $900,000. That's the makeup during this fiscal year. Now, the hope will be that some folks take advantage of the opt-out program where the city gives a cash payment. If you move off the health insurance plan, go into your spouse's health insurance, that would reduce the appropriation. But this is not a final number at this particular point in time. Next. The pension increase will be $436,537. That's based on the schedule, the appropriation schedule that PIRAC, the state agency, and the actuaries develop. We're still on a full funding schedule. We'll pay off the pension liability in 2033. Just want to note, the summer retirement system has had 2 years in a row the highest investment return of any of the retirement systems in Massachusetts. That's the, well, thank you. I'm chairman of the retirement board, by the way, so I wanted to get that out there. And Mike is on the retirement board too, all right? So that reduced the unfunded liability by about $30 million since the last actuarial evaluation. So that will be paid off in 2023. Just to note, as we all know, energy costs are going up. Here. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So on the retirement system, so it's been a multi-year process to try to get our retirement fund divested from fossil fuels. We've been caught up for many. What level of discretion? You know, we have 2 members of the retirement board here. On a discretionary level, how can we direct those investments away from fossil fuels?
We want more discretion, as you know. We've been fighting for that. We're up against the PIRAC, the state agency. There's been legislation in the state legislature that we would hope would pass. We have minimized our investments in fossil fuel. I don't remember the exact number here, but we've minimized it, and still you can see the investment returns here. So if we get the statutory authority to completely divest, we will do so. And the energy costs, just to note, this will impact, it's going to impact vendor contracts as well in terms of...
Mr. Bean?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you just, real quick, I'm sorry, on that last piece of the last question, the answer to your question.
Sure.
So, you know, so Somerville's a real success story in that we've brought it down to a minimum, but yet we've brought in these, as you said, what did you say, amazing returns that you got, I think, on the retirement fund. So that's something that we should really promote, I would think.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
You can look at our portfolios on the retirement website. You can see, you know, the composition of the investment strategy there. And this will just show you some of the energy prices that are obvious now. Speaking with DPW, we'll probably see an 8% increase in the motor gas account, but they have been doing a lot of work with boiler replacement. They'll report to you at budget time. We probably will be able to level fund the heating, oil, and natural gas accounts due to their energy efficiency activities.
Is there a question?
At one moment, do we start looking at the future, and this is, you know, I love buildings and infrastructure, and start saying we really need to start investing in our building because, let's say, the Winter Hill and the Brown School, we might as well put dollar bills in the cracks and just let it fly away. So at one moment, do we start thinking about our energy future and really start thinking of investing in buildings? And maybe it's just a statement. on a personal thing, and maybe I just stood on a soapbox, even though I'm not a soapbox person, so, sorry. Sorry about that.
We haven't invested enough in buildings, and that's why we have to allocate money every year in the capital plan. I think he's allocated a couple $1 million every year now to borrow. I think with the new high school, there were great moves to make that building energy efficient. So I think we do have a dedicated team in place now in our departments to be looking at this in a comprehensive way and with a future look on that one. But again, yeah, this is absolutely essential that we put money aside for this. Next. So coming down to the numbers. The level service budget increase is $10.9 million. And let me tell you what that encompasses. It encompasses the things we've talked about. That encompasses all non-union and union salary increases of currently now. It does encompass the salary contingency, all of the service level proposals that have been given to us by department heads, the debt service increases, the pension increases, the preliminary health insurance increase, as well as the original base budget increase for the school department of 5%. So that gets you to the 10.9. That encompasses the 7.9. Now, as we move to the next slide, the school department budget is 84,287, a 10% increase, which the mayor supports. And we'll be putting that forward once the school committee will vote the budget, is an increase of $8,426,700. So 5% of that increase is built into this $10.9 million number. So if we go to 10%, we'd be adding on another $4.2 million, roughly, onto that 10.9. So that, doing a little math, that gets you to 15.1 million, roughly. Potential revenue capacity, as I said, 19.6 million. So that does leave capacity here under the levy limit of several $1 million for initial new programming and new initiatives. And, we'll of course, be looking at these numbers on the revenue estimates again, as I said. The mayor is evaluating now all of the various program improvement requests and your goals and initiatives that you've submitted to her. And she's in the process of doing that the next couple of weeks. Maybe I'll turn it over to Mike in terms of what the process is going to be going forward.
Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. Mike Mastroboni, Budget Director for the city. It's a great transition because I've got about an hour and a half or so on where we go from here. Just kidding, we're on our way out the door. Wanted to talk to the council about where we go from here, what's next. I've been speaking with Councilor Wilson, Chair of Finance, about what this process looks like. We're really excited to show off some of the initiatives that I've been spending a lot of time in the mayor's office discussing. Looking forward to the mayor presenting the administration's budget on June 2nd. And we're hoping to post the document a few days before that on May 31st, whether it's the numbers or the full document. We're gonna try and get that out as early as possible. So one of the main things that we have to wait for here is that the school committee is expecting to vote their budget on the 26th. And in discussion with Chair of Finance, Wilson, we're anticipating budget review meetings June 6th through 16th with a final vote, hopefully, if all goes well, at the regular council meeting on June 23rd. So we've been throwing, go ahead.
Can I just clarify? I think we're going to have, we talked about this, we're going to have 21st and 22nd likely. So yeah, don't get too excited. There are going to be some meetings on the 21st and 22nd as well.
Thank you, that's right. So the plan is to have a cut night the 22nd and an overflow night on the 21st. I do believe, we do believe that we can move expeditiously through this process, balancing in-depth discussion with focus on the budget. So,
And at one point, it will end up being 7 nights. We'd said 6. There's a public comment night, basically a public hearing that's gonna be June 6th. And then we're really gonna dive into this.
sure, that's right. I think last year, the public hearing was the same night as police. I'm thinking of nights of hearings. Obviously, the passion of mine is the budget hearing nights. And I get to watch from home the work that you folks do, listening to our residents. So we're talking about a couple real changes around the edges. We're hoping to set up a system in which counselors can share questions with city staff in advance where possible, so that we can do the work ahead of time to get the answers to the questions that you want to hear, that residents want to hear, and not have to worry about sharing documents later, getting all that in what is a pretty short window and a lot of work. Another opportunity that we've been talking about is in a situation where there are no questions for a department, cruising right through. Some departments have major changes, some departments have very minimal changes. So that's an opportunity that we have, and I've spoken to department heads about that. Some folks are a little bit excited about that. The last one, we're planning on this in person, so it's great to be with everyone here. Looking forward to being with the Finance Committee as well as Finance Committee as a whole to discuss budget next month. The last piece before I hand it off to either the mayor or Ed or whoever wants to close us out here, we've got emails of budget staff here. Folks know Ed, most of you know me. We also have Megan Huckenpaller here, our new budget analyst. She's up there. Please feel free. Shouts out to Megan. Please feel free to email us with questions. I'm happy to share my phone number. Some of you probably already have it. We want to work through this collaboratively. We want to be able to answer your questions, and we want to make this an efficient process. We're really looking forward to it, and we're excited to share some of the new information. So, Chair.
I have questions or comments or both, and it's gone. Thank you so much for giving us this timeline and details for budget season, and thank you, Councilor Wilson, for all the work that you've done ahead of this. Just a couple quick questions. In person, does that mean that the entire public hearing will be in person?
Sounds like a great question that we should figure out.
I will give a comment then. I would encourage us to have a hybrid model. COVID is surging right now. The fact that we are in this room and together is a little bit concerning. And I would encourage the chair of the committee to pursue a hybrid model for the wonderful. It will be hybrid. I want to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible. Just a couple of oversight questions around process, but that are rooted in a comment. So the potential for skipping departments without question, would that mean that departments wouldn't come before us for a public hearing at all if there were no questions in advance?
No, that's not my expectation.
Okay.
I've told department heads to expect to be there the night they're scheduled, if something comes up in the last couple days.
Great. I only ask that because I'll speak for myself. I am a working counselor. I do not do this full time. I'm excited to be prepped in advance and get the budget weeks before we may have these hearings. And also sometimes I see JT has a question, Councilor Scott. Sometimes questions get brought to us by the public days of meetings. So I'm glad that we will still have department heads expecting to be there, but we may cruise by them if there's no questions on the docket for them.
That's exactly how I've been thinking of it. So.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. Councilor Scott.
I was just raising my finger. It's like one week. If we get this on schedule, we have about 1 week before we start reviewing departments. It would be helpful for generating questions if we had it more than 1 week in advance.
More questions?
Do we have a schedule for the budget hearings yet? Is that available to counselors? Is it posted? Oh, can I ask one more question, then I'll hand this over to you? Seconding Councilor Kelly's request for a hybrid model, similarly, while we're in a COVID surge, concerned that if we don't have a hybrid model for all of this, that we may be missing some counselors. So I would encourage us to think about that during this particular surge that is higher than Omicron.
Yeah, absolutely. I would expect that the same thing would be in effect that's been in effect for city council meetings that are in person, that if you can't make it, then it becomes a hybrid thing where you're allowed to participate remotely. In terms of the schedule, it's been communicated to the clerk, Peter, well, the clerk of, what was Peter's title? Clerk of committees? Clerk of committees. I think there was a little bit of finalization of it, but yeah, it's basically, it is what I've shown you previously. That's what we're gonna do.
Quick question to the point about the hybrid. I am in total agreement that we should be doing hybrid, but I also know that the reason that we can do hybrid is because of the state, and that does expire. And I'm just wondering if the administration is tracking that expiration. I know that folks in Boston are quite concerned about how this is going to operate over there. Just want to flag that and make sure that we put a plan in place for what the future of our government looks like.
Thank you for that comment. Absolutely. We went through that. I remember phone conversations with Councilor Scott. We ran into the same problem and actually had to cancel a night. So we're keeping an eye on that, and we'll make sure we move along.
This is a comment, not a question.
Sure.
Members of the public, if you come to our public hearing on whatever night it might be, we obviously do not have a mask mandate in place. I'm wearing a mask. Many of our colleagues are wearing masks. This is my implore to our public to wear masks if they come to the public hearing. Keep our neighbors safe, stop community spread. We know that masks are extremely effective. This is not a statement on behalf of the council. This is just me, a person who had COVID, asking people to wear masks.
We did release a statement on behalf of the council saying that masks are effective. So I will say that this is a statement on behalf of the council.
Are there additional questions?
If I could just make one comment. Having been through, we have all been through the hoops when somebody cannot be, when a counselor in particular cannot be present in person because of a COVID exposure. We are missing one of our colleagues tonight. We have, this is, given how incredibly dense the budget departmental reviews are, given how intense the entire process is, having just tried to limp through myself being remote for a finance committee meeting, I think it is a recipe for disaster to expect that we are going to be having these meetings in person and then have one of the voices of the finance committee left out of the room. I would encourage us, if the public hearing is decided to be hybrid so as to be as inclusive as possible, I can support that. I would just implore the chair to consider that the budget night meetings, the departmental review meetings, be held in a manner that we know is going to be safe and reproducible. So if we could move those to remote, I would encourage it. But just one voice out of 5, one voice out of 11. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on this discussion around hybrid versus non-hybrid, to the clerk, I'm just curious, like this whole hybrid thing in general, like is it legal? Like can people testify, like while we're in person, we're in an in-person meeting, their testimony is counted. They don't have to be in person.
Yes, through the president, until July 15th, when the governor's order expires, it is allowable and it is legal.
Can you just say that in the mic? I don't think people on the stream can hear us anyhow.
Thank you. Yes, until the governor's order expires, which currently is set for July 15th, it is allowable and legal for meetings to be remote and or hybrid.
Thank you. I'll, do whatever the pleasure of the chair, but I think it can get pretty messy when you try to do hybrid, especially for these things. So I don't know, but I'll go. It's your.
Colleagues, I would just say this conversation, I think we should have outside the context of this meeting. If there are questions on other comments.
Whatever. I just want to say thank you to everyone for doing this. I think it was extremely helpful. That's all.
looks like if there's no more questions, I'll say on behalf of the mayor and all, Ed, Evan, all the staff that's here, thank you so much for attending and for your thoughtful questions. We look forward to working with you on budget. I'll hand it back to Councilor Ewan Campen.
Absolutely. Mayor, do you have anything you'd like to close with?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you. I hope this was informative, and, we're here to share as much information as possible with you. Look forward to the budget hearings.
Thank you very much, Mayor Ballantyne, and to everyone who presented tonight, and to all of my colleagues. There is no more business before the council.
No further business before the council, Mr. President.
Are there any late items?
There are no late items.
Councilor Davis moves to adjourn. We are adjourned.